Okay, guys, we're going to get started on the next panel. I want to start it off in an interactive way. Who here has actually tried virtual reality? Just raise your hands for me real quick. I just want to get a context set. Okay, nice. And who here has tried WebVR? All right, that's about what I expected. Today we're going to be talking about the future of what we're kind of calling the immersive web, for lack of a better term. We've got a really awesome panel here today. I'm really excited to have a conversation with them and with you guys. Just to kind of do a brief check-in of where we stand today. Today, if Wi-Fi was working, you'd be able to go and get a WebVR-enabled browser, Firefox or Chromium, plug in an Oculus headset, and using WebGL, build a website that is not a site, it's a world that you can step into. Today, you can go down the street, walk into a store, buy a Samsung phone, drop it into a $99 holder from Samsung, and download a VR browser. A browser actually built for virtual reality. It lets you explore the web in VR. You can go get AltspaceVR, which is a social web VR application, create an avatar, and then watch a 90-foot YouTube Chromium instance of a Super Bowl game or of a comedy show. And if you're so inclined, you can actually build WebVR experiences using markup or JavaScript, using a couple different frameworks. So that's where we stand today. What we want to talk about is where this is all heading in the next couple of years. To do that, we're lucky to be joined by a really awesome panel of some of the people who are making this possible. Starting from our left, going to our right, Diego Marcos is a software engineer with Mozilla on the Mozilla virtual reality research team, MozVR. Diego is one of the co-creators of A-Frame, a new framework for creating WebVR experiences that work just with simple custom elements. Next to him is Mike Blix from Samsung, software engineer at Samsung. I met Mike a couple years ago at an SVVR meetup, Silicon Valley VR meetup, and Mike showed me a demo of a bunch of Chromium instances in a virtual reality void. I could actually browse in virtual reality. One of the first demos I'd seen of that. In August, Mike joined Samsung, and then a couple months later, Samsung shipped their VR browser. Tony Parisi, written lots of books, contributed lots of very important specs. Tony's been here since the beginning of there being a notion of VR on the web. Currently, VP of Platform Products at WeVR, who are doing some really awesome stuff in the VR space, and he'll tell us about that today. Brandon Jones. The reason we can even have this conversation is because Brandon Jones and Vlad Vukicevic at Mozilla got together and thought, what API do we need to plug in a headset and actually create a virtual reality website? Brandon, from the Chrome team, where he works on WebGL implementation, co-authored a spec with Vlad, and in summer of 2014, began to ship experimental builds of Chromium and Firefox nightly with WebVR enabled. He's going to be able to tell us a little bit today about where WebVR, the API, is actually going next. Then Gavan Wilhite. I hope I got that right. Yes, all right. So Gavan is the founder of AltspaceVR, which is a really, really interesting startup that's doing social VR. You can kind of think of them as, like, I think, the new school. They've taken a very different approach to web plus VR, and we're going to hear about that today. And then Jason Marsh. Jason Marsh I wanted to bring up because I don't know if you saw his panel today, but he did a presentation on an experience he's created called Reflow. And Jason's a really good example of a guy who's got years and years of web development experience, went to a couple meetups, saw WebVR, and thought, I've got to be part of this. I want to actually help make this a reality. So he's going to tell us a little bit today about what he's learned and what he aspires to do as a developer. So let's get started then. First question, I think, to Tony. Everything I've just said, if anyone's familiar with VRML, we've kind of heard this before. VR has been tried before. I mean, it's literally been around since the 60s as a concept. Why in God's name should anyone here take this seriously?
Yeah, that's an awesome question to kick this off. So, without dating myself and getting into my own personal experience and having tried VR from a few different angles earlier, the reason I think we're at a good time for this is threefold. The first is electronics have just gotten really cheap. We can actually afford VR hardware systems as consumers. We can actually buy a headset for a few $100s. Right now, the high-end machines are connected to very expensive computers, but that's only going to get cheaper over the next few years. And we can buy mobile headsets that connect to phones as well, all for a reasonable price, and they're only going to get cheaper. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is that as developers, we understand how to build this stuff a lot better than we did when people were trying years and years ago. There's a ton of experience in design and development on, particularly coming from video games, driven by gaming over the last several years, but coming from other disciplines as well that make us all understand better the kind of things we need to do. So there'll be a lot of experimentation. It'll be rapid, but it's going to converge quickly on useful applications. But finally, the third thing, and the most important, which none of the other two would matter without this, is that we now have one, maybe arguably two generations of people who've grown up with interactive 3D experiences, game consoles, and mobile gaming. And we did not have that, certainly when the original VR was being tried in the 60s, certainly not when people were trying it in the early 90s. So I think all these things come together, and we're going to see some really, really broad adoption of VR over the next couple of years because of those three factors.
Nice. Anyone want to add to that at all? What do you guys see as being, the way I frame this is in a couple years, I'm still going to have a Retina laptop. It's really fast. I'm going to have a really nice phone that's going to have a great browser built into it. And meanwhile, if I want to do VR, like native VR with Unity and Unreal Engine is just going to blow your mind. Like peerless performance, beautiful experiences. In that world, when I put on my headset, when I get home at the end of the day, or whatever the circumstances are, like what is going to motivate me to click on an icon that launches WebVR? Like what is it that is special about WebVR that needs to exist?
So if I can approach this one from the viewpoint of WebGL, in addition to working on WebVR on Chrome, I also work on implementing the WebGL API. And when that API first started, everybody looked at it and said, this is going to be great for games on the web. That's what a lot of people talked about, games on the web. And then we got it out there, and it took a little bit to get to the point where it was stable enough and on enough platforms that people could make use of it. But what didn't happen is an explosion of games on the web. We certainly see that. You know, people do build games with WebGL, and they're great games. But the really compelling content, the stuff that's really blown us away, has mostly been in the way of data visualization and art. And expressing like Google Maps, expressing that information in a way that you can't quite do with just the 2D graphics. And almost none of it looks like a game. And in retrospect, that makes a lot of sense because everybody's comfortable going on Steam or Origin or whatever your platform is and downloading a binary executable to run the latest AAA game. But if you ask somebody to do the same thing in order to see one shader out of like Shader Toy, nobody would do it. Nobody's going to bother to do native executable for that kind of content. But if you say, click on this link in Twitter, and now you can see this incredible GPU optimized shader that somebody built on Shader Toy, or math visualization that somebody created to explain quaternions, or 3D version of the globe, or any number of other types of data that have come out of that. That's really compelling. And I think that you're going to see the same thing for VR on the web. It's probably not going to drive the AAA games. They have their platform, they have their tools, they know how to do what they're going to do. But there's going to be a whole lot of fringe edge cases where really what you're looking at is visualizing data or creating art or just doing something that can be disseminated really easily, that the web is going to be the right platform for that.
Bite-sized experiences, right?
What's it?
Bite-sized experiences, small experiences that you just pop in and out. And
Right. I mean, it's the Shader Toy model.
Yeah.
Shader Toy would not exist in a meaningful fashion if it was a binary executable.
Right.
And I think the hope, too, is that not only is it lower friction for users in a lot of ways, but it's lower friction for companies, too, right, who have an existing website, an existing web platform. Just to add some virtual reality components to it, I think is a much easier ask than create a whole application and worry about compatibility with all these different headsets and all that kind of stuff.
From my interest as the developer, end developer of all the great stuff that these guys have been building, some of the really compelling use cases are in education, but also in cross-platform. So what if you have a web browser, and this is almost 100% working today. What if you have a web browser and you're looking at some 360 environment, some 3D world, just scrolling around with your mouse as you click and scroll? Well, there's a button in the corner. Click it, send it to your phone, maybe you're on your phone. Now suddenly you move your phone around and you can see the world. click another button. Thanks to Boris Muss at Google, click another button. Now you can drop it in cardboard, and you're there. You're in that space. Or you could take the same set of code and drop it into a Vive, thanks to Brendan's Chromium beta, where you can do WebGL, do WebVR in Chromium on an HTC Vive, which is the top of the line. That's it. It's all these different levels of experience you can get with the web that you're not going to, people are not even going to think about doing if they're doing full-blown games and all those download situations. And then, you know, one use case I'm working on is for educational VR. You've got a classroom, maybe from somewhere between middle school through college. Everybody's got a smartphone in their pocket. If you have a bunch of cardboards, Google Cardboards sitting around, and some of them, I call them plastics because they're plastic versions of Google Cardboard. You can have a couple of dozen of these sitting in the classroom for almost no cost. Now you can have the whole class go to a website, see VR, and do it together. And there's no way you get a whole classroom to download an app and install it on their phones.
Yeah.
So the web,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
web
And who is going to
argument-
build that app too for a school? Who's got the budget to build that app for a school as well, as opposed to building a website?
Right. And then the last piece is, if it's web content, then your professor/teacher, even the students, especially maybe with A-Frame, is going to be able to build content to show to their fellow classmates or to their students. The argument for web VR is incredibly compelling on that level. And are those big games? No. They're simple, maybe simple experiences. Maybe they're a 5-minute experience. Maybe they're a 2-minute experience. But I think it's a very different world than thinking about publishing a great big game in VR.
Yeah. So the original question is, how would I strap a headset every day and open a browser to consume VR? But the other angle of it is like, how would I develop for the web VR instead of native, right? Because we want the web development workflow that we use and love today to apply also to the VR medium, right? I just want to open a GitHub repo, put some code together, create a GitHub pages, link, and send it to my friend. How do you do that in native, right?
We have a lot of people in the audience, I think, who've tried virtual reality but are new to WebVR. In order to kind of prime the rest of the conversation, if I'm going to try and go home tonight and do this, what do I need to know today to get started? Like just the bare bones information I need. Maybe Jason, I'll throw it to you, because speaking as a developer yourself.
So I started doing VR less than 18 months ago. I'm a startup guy, but I quit my healthcare gig, and I've been focused on UI experience for forever. Too long. No, but the first thing I did is I started showing up at meetups, right? Especially in this city, it's unbelievable. There's a meetup practically every night of the week that has something to do with WebGL or 3D or VR or the cinematic VR production. So showing up was a great way to get started. But then the typical experiment, Google every problem. 3JS has a huge community and huge set of code bits you can find online, and to just figure it out and plug and play and put it together.
Cool.
Yeah. On the browser side, like that's great resources for development. Right now, none of the stable browsers have this shipping today, and so if you want to get a browser that allows it to work with your, Oculus DK2 or Vive or whatever, go to webvr.info.
Yep.
It's a terrible, terrible, crappy little web page, but it will link you to the right points to get the Chromium or Firefox browsers to begin experimenting with that.
It's not crappy. It's efficient. He's being self-effacing. I like it. It's very simple. Easy URL to remember as well. I kind of wanted to, and thanks. I think it's a good primer. Let's look at the future then. I think everyone would agree. Anyone who's tried VR and tried a bad VR experience, you can be nauseous for hours afterwards. So I joked at a presentation at Mozilla that the bug reports in VR are kind of crazy. Like, I threw up. That's an amazing bug report. But those are the stakes, And so if there's one thing the web has struggled with in the last couple of years, on mobile in particular, it's been performance. Like, I was a lead designer on Firefox OS for a couple of years. I was trying to get the web to be 60 FPS, rock solid, and when I touched a button, it needed to respond visually within under 120 milliseconds. Like, that's really hard. And now, all of a sudden, we aspire to do, I don't know if you're familiar with the specs for VR, but it's like 90 hertz, sub 20 milliseconds, you turn your head, you see a result on screen, and jank is the worst thing in the world. So the performance bar is insanely, insanely high. The question I'd pose to you guys, and actually maybe Gavin, I'd like to throw to you on this one, is Brendan Eich recently on Twitter said, trying to do WebVR in the browser is pushing too big a rock up too big a hill. You guys from day one, I mean, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you guys started with Unity, started with native,
Yep.
and then you've been selective in pulling in the web, like pulling in a Chromium kind of wall, you know? Can you speak a little bit to why you guys made that decision and kind of your perspective from AltSpace's perspective on the performance story?
Yeah, definitely. So as he said, we use Unity as the game engine for a large part of the experience. So the most important thing for us to begin with was getting it so people could be in that space together, right? You have basic avatars, you can be in this environment and interact. And then the next thing we needed is content and things for people to do. So that's when we looked at the web. And so the nice thing about being in a game engine like Unity is that all of the VR performance stuff is basically handled for you up until that point. You still have to make sure that your poly counts and draw calls and all that stuff are low, but you can be assured that you will get the best performance that you possibly can. And then when we look at web content, we, rather than looking at it as sort of like a full screen experience, so to speak, where it sort of takes over the entire room, we look at it more as these sort of holograms that are sort of in front of you, where it's this sort of like, it's like a window like it would be on your desktop, but it's a 3D window in this case. And so we can actually manage performance inside of that, where sometimes we'll only update the 3D objects in that window at like 30 hertz, but the entire world and the people and stuff like that are still moving around at 90. And you can lerp that in your game engine too, where we can actually correct for some of those performance issues after the fact. So we think about it a little bit differently, but that's how we've been handling performance. Yeah.
Nice, nice. And then, Brandon, I mean, as the WebGL implementer, WebVR implementer on Chromium, I know we've had this conversation before, but where would you say WebVR in a traditional browser performance stands today? And can you give us an idea of what you see as being the next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, where we stand today is not good enough. There's honestly, it's amazing that it works as well as it does, but it's not going to be the type of thing that is really compelling next to a native app if we look at it as it is today. We're taking multiple steps to correct that, both in terms of just making sure that the browser has better tools available to it. We're working on WebGL 2. This will expose the OpenGL ES3 feature set. Gives you a lot of new capabilities, new performance optimizations that you can apply to your 3D scenes. So that gives you one step up in efficiency. We're refactoring the WebVR API. So anybody who's been playing around with it thus far, I apologize profusely, but we are going to break your stuff. The different stakeholders in the API have been talking about it. We're taking the feedback that we've gotten from the initial month's worth of people playing around with these APIs and looking at the difference between where the hardware and the APIs were when we started and where the native hardware is now, and updating the API to take that into account so that it maps better to the underlying systems and gives people more capabilities to work around some of the performance issues that we have. So being able to more directly push imagery to the HMD, for example. And then, beyond that, there's just going to be a layer of things happening at the ecosystem level with, graphics drivers and whatnot. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going into making sure that the various OSs that this is running on don't get in the way, and that we have more direct access to the hardware. We've got Vulkan DirectX 12 and stuff like that coming out, and even though those aren't going to be accessible through the browser, the fact that they're available on the OS will help reduce some of the overhead there as well. So there's a lot of momentum towards getting us to a better place performance-wise.
Nice, nice. Jordan?
So where was Brendan going with that? Saying don't do it at all? Or was he just saying this is a really big task? I mean, think about the rock at the top of the hill once it's up there. What has it acquired? Shit ton of potential energy. Which can do a hell of a lot of damage when you push it back down, right? So, yeah, I mean, these are really hard problems to solve, but they're getting solved. The browsers are going to work on the bits and pieces Brandon was just going to talk about. If people have figured out how to be smart enough to render in 16 milliseconds to have 60 FPS, they can get to 11 or 5.5, depending on how you slice it, 1 per eye. Can do really amazing stuff if they do their JavaScript engineering correctly. So I don't view any of these things as impossible. They're all going to, the performance curves are going to be there, and we're going to catch up with them as developers over the next little while.
Right.
So I don't see the difficulty of the task as being a reason not to go after it if you're motivated to try to create web-style experiences, again, as opposed to trying to make a buck tomorrow doing AAA games.
Right, right. Gavin, did you want to add something?
Oh yeah, I just real fast. I think the other point too is that from a content creation side, like think like you're programming for a PS2, right? Like you can probably go a little bit further than that, but like look at the tricks they did. Look at things like World of Warcraft where they're making a lot with low poly counts. You can do a lot with art to make these things look incredible, even if you're not using too many CPU resources and GPU resources.
Right.
To that point, this is something that I've brought up in the past. One of the most spectacular hits of the last few years in the gaming world is Minecraft. Like, people don't require high poly counts to have a good experience. Like, there's a lot that can be done with just the way you present the data.
Yeah. Mike, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just comes down to scope. I mean, developers aren't going to be targeting AAA games for WebVR, and I think when you don't have that graphical fidelity level that you're targeting, it is going to be a reachable target, and these underlying platform issues are going to be solved by Google and Samsung and Mozilla.
Yeah. Let's stay with you then. A lot of us have been tinkering with what a WebVR browser would actually look like. You've actually shipped one, twice technically. My background is user experience design. You really can't think of a bigger gap from a user experience design than between a keyboard and mouse or a mobile device with an accelerometer and virtual reality. I mean, it's a radically different input and display paradigm. I'm really interested, like just from a design standpoint and from an engineering standpoint, what did you guys learn in the development of the Gear VR browser? And can you maybe give us some idea of kind of where you aspire to take things next?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one starting consideration is that virtually 100% of content on the web right now is not VR, so we have to kind of work within that context of having a virtual display where we display kind of the traditional mobile web. So if you're not familiar, the Gear VR has a trackpad on the side where you can swipe and tap, and that's kind of maps pretty closely to what you can do on mobile. So that's kind of where we started out. We also have a software keyboard in there that you can bring up. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. We have that virtual screen in front of you that you can interact with, and from there you can launch into kind of more VR-specific content like 360 video, using standard HTML5 or other video sites. So from there, where do you take it? That's kind of the next step. A lot of it depends on what happens to input, right? Input's kind of hard when you can't see your hands, you can't see a keyboard. With us, it's a mobile device, so you don't have those traditionally accessible. That is one of the biggest things we want to figure out. How do you make that input work really well? Right now, it's actually kind of more than sufficient for tapping and getting around when you are focused on getting that VR content. So, kind of a lot in the pipeline for how we make that better.
That's very enticing. Diego, you and I were two of the guys who made A-Frame over the last 6 months, and you mentioned tooling before. Can you kind of talk about what the rationale behind A-Frame was, and kind of where you see A-Frame and GLAM, which is Tony's framework, which we took a lot of ideas from, and Scene VR, which is also in the same line. Like, we see a lot of people who are still kind of chasing the dream of declarative world building. Like, why do you think that is, and what do you think the appeal of that is?
So the rationale is because we love VRML. No, kidding. So the rationale behind it is like we believe that VR is going to be the next big medium, and personally I think like the 2D web is going to be a subset of this bigger medium. And currently there's like a skill gap, right, in the web. So the skills that you need to develop VR are skills that are related to computer graphics and video game development. And there's some very nice tools out there. You have 3JH, you have Play Canvas, you have a Turbulence, you have a lot of nice 3D game engines that are very well designed. but they're appealing for a different kind of audience. It's more for game developers that they want to come to the web. And right now there's a market that is not covered, which is, the web developer has like already a set of skills, and how can we introduce these people into this new medium in a way that the learning curve is as smooth as possible. And that's the reason behind A-Frame and GLAM, that our idea is not new. A-Frame is our take on a declarative layer to be able to create 3D worlds. But the rationale behind it is like, we just want to onboard web developers into this new medium. And A-Frame, as its current form today, maybe it's an interim solution. And as web developers get more familiarized with the VR medium, A-Frame can develop into something very different in the future. We will see. But the goal is like, let those developers to use the skills they already have and learn a few new concepts, and then they can do VR experiences in the web. That's the rationale.
I think our metaphor was not to refer to you guys, well, maybe, that the web development community were like the mountainous hill tribes of VR compared to like the native developers kind of roam. It's like there's lots and lots of us. And if we can just kind of beat the drum in the right way and get web developers to actually jump into this, it will be very interesting to see what happens. You combine that with low friction publishing, decentralization, a lack of gatekeepers, like that gets very intriguing. The other metaphor we used was A-Frame and WebVR in general were our attempt to kind of throw a match into a dry field. It's not about kind of A-Frame is not particularly important in the long term. It's more about getting the ball rolling and getting people to start hacking and creating. Like, it probably won't be any one of us who invents the blue underline link of VR. It'll probably be one of you or someone in the vast community out there. So it's about trying to find ways to build this collectively and kind of trigger the emergence that I think is the unique strength of WebVR.
There's another personal reason for A-Frame. For me, it's a bit controversial because we're in a web development kind of conference. So I hit an inflection point, right? So I've been doing websites for a long time. I did static websites, PHP, Django, Rails, Node, Backbone, Angular, React, you name it, right? But at the end of the day, it's to do what? Carousels, drop-down menus, buttons? Jesus. I don't want to be doing that the rest of my life. I just want more, right?
Amen, brother. Amen.
And I love React and I love Angular. There's a lot of smart people, but it's just the learning new APIs for the sake of learning new APIs. I just want to do new things that were not possible before, right? And A-Frame is like personal interest of mine. Yeah.
Did you want to add to that, Tony? I mean, you've been at this for longer than any of us.
No, I mean, you guys summed that up pretty well. I kind of stumbled into doing another markup language for VR. I originally worked on VRML. Thanks for the shout out. When I was going to conferences evangelizing 3JS and WebGL, and I would be doing a talk, I'd tell people how to use 3JS, and there's just a bunch of pages and pages of JavaScript code on the screen to put up a camera and get a cube spinning around on the screen, right? And then I'd go next door at the HTML5 conference or wherever, and they would be showing Bootstrap templates and 2 lines of JavaScript, and I realized it was this giant abyss in skills and orientation of most of the designers who were coming to these conferences, and we're probably going to want to do something in WebGL besides making a game, which you need the hardcore engineering skills for. And so that got me excited to take a fresh look at the idea and see if we could just pair some simple markup as a designer's expression with a very simple way of driving things with code as people interacted with the scene. And so I was doing all that pre-VR before the Oculus hysteria happened a couple years ago. I started working on the heart of glam. Same motivations as you, though, you were just talking about exactly. It's just like, what's a designer to do? But I love what you were talking about. I don't know if we're jumping the gun on your agenda, Josh, but I love what you were talking about where we're taking this with user interface. Yeah. So I don't know if you were planning on going there.
No, that's actually right what I wanted to take. And actually, Gavin, I wanted to throw to you because what's so neat, I don't know if anyone's heard of Janus. Janus is another attempt to, instead of trying to bring the entire web forward, Janus and I think Altspace are attempts to kind of start with VR and then the needs of VR and then work your way to the web. And as a result, they've managed to move really, really fast. I mean, when I first visited your office before you guys were even AltspaceVR, and you were showing us stuff that was amazing at like beautiful performance, using Razer hydras, I think. I built a house out of Chromium instances. That was pretty cool in virtual reality. So I really look at Janus and AltspaceVR in particular as being, I mean, besides just being great products that seem to have a lot of momentum, they're kind of like laboratories. They, I believe, are out there ahead of the traditional browser vendors and the API authors actually showing us what people want to do. So I'm curious to you, Gavan, like, what are some of the things that have surprised you the most, and what are some of the places where you've seen the most momentum for WebVR in AltspaceVR?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is a ton of fun because we can just like add APIs overnight, and like they have no standards to them, and we just see people use them, which is awesome. And like I would love to get standards around this stuff at some point, but like one of the ones that was great to see is we added in a API for tracking skeleton, so you can get access to all the body sensors that are plugged in. And so to see people do it for everything from like attaching things as like a heads-up display off of your center eye position to doing like little laser tag stuff and using the Leap Motion integration. So that's been fun. I think the thing that continuously surprises me is just I feel like I have figured out all that we can do with like one limited subset of something, and then someone will come up with some crazy way of doing it. Like we don't have skeletal animation in there, but people will just spawn a whole bunch of little spheres and like walk them as if they're like a person, you know. Yeah, I think if we give if we give the right layers of abstraction to people where they can build their own tools, build their own systems, build their own frameworks on top of this, that's where we're going to see a ton of innovation.
Well, can you tell us a little bit where you guys are going? I mean, I know you're working on a JS API. The initial version of AltspaceVR was about letting me create an instance of a Chromium window.
Right.
But you mentioned kind of the holographic.
Right.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the way that we did our implementation is, since we're not actually modifying the browser internals, we have sort of you can think of it sort of like a web view inside of there where we can sort of put code injections, we're using 3JS itself. And so the nice thing about that is one of the things that we found out is that it's really useful to have like semantic data about these objects because like we want to be able to like click on them and like fire mouse events and stuff like that, which you need to have a physics representation of this object in order to do that, which normally is different from the visual mesh, right? So you have to be exposing these sorts of things. And the other one is the synchronization stuff. So like there's been lots of attempts to make web pages synchronized in the past where I'm looking at it on my screen, you're looking at it on your screen, we're seeing exactly the same thing. But in VR, it's actually critical if you're in a social context, because if I'm looking at this, like one of my favorite examples, so if I'm looking at like a big chessboard on the floor that we're rendering as a web page, and I move a chess piece, and you're looking at it, you need to see that chess piece move, right? And that scales in complexity to whatever content creation system, art thing that you're doing. And so literally every service has to be synchronized across all the clients. Yeah, so tricky problems, but yeah.
So continuing kind of the UI streak, so one of the things you can't do right now with the current WebVR API that's about to get fixed is you can't go from site to site because we're using the full screen API and the security model doesn't allow for it. So you plug in your headset, you click enter VR on a website, and you can put on your headset, but if you try to go to another domain, you get kicked out of VR mode, you got to take your headset off. It's terrible. We don't have the low friction that you expect from the web yet. But we're about to resolve that. The API that Brandon and folks from actually most people on the stage are all contributing to this. It's going to be circulated for public feedback really soon. One of the things it's going to resolve is going from site to site to site securely in virtual reality. And then all of a sudden, you got a new set of problems. How do I know where I'm going? Is there a loading indicator? How do I enter in a new URL? We basically have to reinvent the entire browsing user experience, the entire paradigm for virtual reality. This is where science fiction begins. This is like the starting gun on true science fiction. Let's just speculate. Like, what does the browser look like in that world to you guys? What excites you about that kind of a world?
The short answer is not quads in space. Eventually, as more and more content, and there's lots of 3D content already out there, everything that has to do with geolocated data, all the Google Maps kinds of things, there's Sketchfab, lots of 3D models out there, but there's lots of ways of thinking about even something like Wikipedia in a 3D way where you see the relationships between the things instead of just quads in space. So that's actually what I want to work on and am working on. The quads in space is a great interim step to get there. But more and more, I want to pull that data off and then see it around me and start to use my whole spatial brain to interact with that information.
Yeah.
Getting rid of browser tabs, right? No more tabs.
Well,
it's all
so
out there.
I actually want to give a counterpoint to that, which is that, it's going to start out as quads in space. I mean, that's kind of what the Samsung browser is right now. But I don't think the quads in space are ever going to go away, and I don't think that they should, because we get an enormous amount of information from that. All of us carry around in our pocket every day a quad that exists in space that gives you lots and lots of information. It's just a flat little screen, but it's incredibly useful. And what we need to do is intelligently say, okay, well, how do we integrate that kind of information, like more of the traditional web content, intelligently into a virtual space that can be filled with so much other stuff. Like, nobody actually wants like the Minority Report API or the UI where you're swinging it around like this, and nobody, like, you don't want to go to Amazon in VR and have like matrix style shelves just shooting past you, and it's like, all right, this is like every CPU that you can buy, and you just got to walk down the aisle. That's terrible. There's always going to be a need for UI shorthands, and it's just how can we use VR to intelligently augment that?
I think there's two interesting points here. One is I think that you can actually do a lot of interesting things with quads in space in VR. You can like bend them so that you have the right sort of curvature from a distance. We actually accidentally support transparency. So if your element is transparent, you can get these crazy sort of things that don't look like quads in space because the edges are transparent, right? And then I think the second point is that these interfaces are probably going to look very different on different VR hardware. So like on the Vive, I would kind of hope that it would be one of these things that's like attached to your hand, where you can sort of look down and see it on your hand. It's a very nice sort of like palette-based interface. Yeah. Where in the Gear VR, that's not going to make as much sense, and it might need to be a plane in space. So just like how we have to have sort of responsive designs on platforms today, I think we're going to have responsive designs to the different VR input devices and headsets.
I like that. If you guys haven't tried the Vive, don't judge VR based on if you've tried a DK2, and the Gear VR is amazing, but don't judge it based on that.
Definitely
someone with a Vive.
Don't judge it on cardboard.
What's that?
Definitely don't judge VR based on cardboard. Cardboard is awesome. That's not what a VR is all about.
This is probably a terrible analogy, but I love terrible analogies. Those are like the gateway drugs. Vive is like the heroin. So everyone, if you take away one thing from this talk, go try heroin. We've got a couple more minutes. I want to wrap up with three of you guys, again, to contribute your thoughts to that kind of previous question. What does a browser look like in a couple years in this kind of science fiction future? I mean, maybe you even want to touch on AR as well, because we talked about VR, but immersive web extends to AR as well. Any thoughts on that?
I'll just jump in real quick. I think I agree with most of what I've been hearing so far, but I just want to emphasize one point in this. We're already, as Vlad Vukovic is famously quipped, we're already in the metaverse, right? It just doesn't have the 3D, the stereoscopic skin yet, right? We are so immersed in our information. We're doing this all day with our phone. I don't have my phone as a prop with me. It's in my bag right now. But we're tapping on it. We're looking at it in the line at Starbucks, and we're in the Caltrain, and we can't get our face out of that thing, right? So it's just inevitable to me that in a short number of years, all our information is going to be around us. We're going to be surrounded by it, and essentially much more immersed in it using stereoscopic displays, either VR or AR. I don't know what those designs are going to look like, but to me that is inevitable and coming very quickly.
Yeah. Right to it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, maybe more of a personal opinion than Samsung's. You can, as you see the hardware improve and the software improve, you can actually see potentially the default way of viewing web pages on a quad actually being on an HMD. And then, of course, you have that quad, but you also have the environment, so you can take full advantage of that. So this seems like an obvious direction to go, and with the quad remaining, right? I mean, that's kind of how our user flows right now. Say like the 360 content that you can launch into, then you go to a different domain, you go back to that quad. It's not that bad of a kind of a user flow at this point. It's familiar and it does work, but again, obviously a lot of potential for making it even better.
Just quickly for the non-graphics folks in the audience, a quad is just a rectangle in space. So yeah, just looks like a square rectangle.
And part of my complaint about it right now, someday I think it's going to be much more usable than it is today because the resolution of the VR headsets, including the Vive, is not as high. It's basically about 1/10 of the resolution of the human eye. So it's hard to read a lot of text. And so what are other ways that we can present information that is appropriate for the resolution and for the medium? Eventually, then to your other question is where does it look like? And I think that in some ways, VR on the web is really a pointer to AR, where you've got glasses that keep that information around you, to Tony's beautiful vision that he described, right? Where instead of looking down, scrolling, you can see it around you. It's a heads-up display all the time. And in some ways, I think that AR is more appropriate for what I'm thinking about doing, but VR is why you can do it today. And AR is still a ways out, and we'll see what Magic Leap has to do because they're so stealth, no one knows. But otherwise, I think it's still a ways out there.
Cool. Well, thank you, guys. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming up. And if you want to learn more about WebVR, I really quite literally mean this. These are 5 of the most knowledgeable and insider people you could possibly talk to. So come hit us up afterwards. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.